Especially when this like security cooperation has been created, has been designed specifically to undermine Russia and to militarily dominate Russia, starting off with the USSR, but then continuing against Russia as a foreign adversary, even after the dissolution of the USSR. But let's take a look at two knowledgeable parties, one of which I actually routinely bring up, Matt, and also Matt Duss, who I had on the broadcast yesterday, and we actually had a conversation around Russia and Ukraine. They had a debate on Democracy Now! This morning.
And President Vladimir Putin are meeting today in Alaska for Ukrainian
President Putin, President Zelensky, and if they can, it'll be great.
All right, this is the intro.
To talk more about the war in Ukraine, U.S.-Russian relations, and more, we're joined by two guests. In Washington, D.C., Matt Duss is with us, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy, former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. And John Mearsheimer joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mearsheimer is professor of political science at the University of Chicago and author most recently of How States Think, the Rationality of Foreign Policy. In 2014, he wrote a widely read piece for Foreign Affairs headlined, Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault. Well, Professor Mearsheimer, let's begin with you. Talk about what's happening today in Alaska and what your view is of Trump's relationship with Putin and Zelensky and what needs to happen now.
Very much wants a peace agreement. He wants to shut down the Ukraine war. But the fact is that he's not able to do that. And meeting in Alaska with Putin today is not going to do anything to help achieve that end. And the principal problem here.
Dude, Mearsheimer thinks U.S. is good and not an empire. He's stupid. I love when people go, I love when people hate Mearsheimer because he's like still very much, an American who has like very American style foreign policy opinions, like, being a China hawk, things of that nature. And then the other side of it is the war hawking liberal international relations understanders who also hate Mearsheimer and say he's a Russian stooge. Yes, Mearsheimer is not a leftist. Okay, he's not. But his analysis, especially as it pertains to Ukraine and Russia before the Russian invasion into Ukraine, has been fairly prescient. It's important to look at a variety of different opinions, even if you don't fully agree with them. Everyone needs to calm down.
Here, Amy, is that the Russians have a series of demands that they will not compromise on, that Trump cannot accept, and certainly the Ukrainians won't accept, and the Europeans won't accept. And those three demands involve the West and Ukraine recognizing that Russia has annexed 4 Ukrainian oblasts and the Crimea. That's number one. Number two is the Russians insist that Ukraine be a neutral state. This basically means it can't be in NATO and it can't have security guarantees from the West, especially the United States. And then the third demand is that Ukraine disarm to the point where it doesn't have significant offensive capability against Russia. These are
the maximalist positions that Vladimir Putin wants to get out of these conversations. They are also directly at odds with objective reality, as far as like the sovereignty of a nation, for example. They're also, it's not maximalist. It absolutely is maximalist. The reason why it's also ridiculous, like no NATO assurances is fine. It's a guarantee anyway. It was a guarantee even before Russia invaded Ukraine, which is part of the reason why I say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not only immoral and totally unjustifiable, but also it was stupid. It was a mistake, in my opinion. Okay? Because Russia had already taken over and annexed Ukrainian territory, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, such as Crimea. And also on top of that, the two oblasts that we're talking about, DPR, LPR, already had enough like Russian intervention that they could have continued meddling in Ukrainian affairs and would never have allowed Ukraine to gain permanent sovereignty or find itself directly in the Western sphere of influence for that reason. So Putin could have just continued to do trade and trade max and meddle in Ukrainian affairs that way and keep Ukraine not directly in the sphere of Western influence without actually killing so many people. If there's no permanent ceasefire, Putin will use it as a time to reset and go back in. Ukraine has actually been extremely successful in defending off Russian forces in many regions since 2014. Russia would also... Wait, what? You can't say that, bro. What the f*** do you mean? Russia literally took over 20% of Ukrainian soil since 2022. That is a crazy statement to make.
Demands are unalterable from a Russian perspective. But obviously, they're unacceptable to the Ukrainians. They're unacceptable to the Europeans. And there's no way that Trump can agree to them. So there'll be a lot of talking today about a lot of issues. But
Russian media is reporting that there was a car waiting for Putin on the tarmac. It's unclear why the Russian leader got inside the beast with Trump. I don't think it's unclear. I think it's very clear why he did that. He wanted alone time with his buddy.
I find it hard to imagine you're going to make any progress towards an agreement.
And Professor Mearsheimer, the mere fact that this summit is between Trump and Putin.
I called that out too when I saw it, because they're not supposed to be alone. The entire meeting is supposed to be with Trump and Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio and then Putin and his envoys. So the fact that they got alone time is actually significant.
Doesn't that, in effect, reinforce the perspective of some that this has essentially been a proxy war between the United States and Russia from the beginning?
Oh, it's clearly been a proxy war, and there's no question that the United States and Russia are almost at war with each other. And therefore, it makes sense for Putin and for Trump to sit down and talk and try to work out the broad parameters of a deal. But the problem is there are two other players in the game, and those two other players are Ukraine and Europe. So you have a situation here, Juan, where even if Putin and Trump were to work out some sort of agreement, they could lay out the parameters of a deal. They have to run that deal by the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And I think if Trump makes the necessary concessions to accommodate the Russians, the problem is that there's no way the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and truth be told, a large chunk of the American national security establishment would accept the deal that Putin worked out. And that's why this one is ultimately going to be settled on the battlefield.
I'd like to bring in Matt Duss to the conversation. Matt, your perspective on this summit in Alaska and what you expect or think may come out of it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in terms of what's going to come out of this summit, I actually don't disagree with Professor Mearsheimer. It seems like there's not been a great deal of preparation going into this summit. And Putin, as the professor said, Putin's goals do not change, if at all. He wants a Ukraine that's effectively under his influence, part of Russia's sphere of control. That's not something the Ukrainians are going to agree with. I think we can imagine a possible resolution to this in which Russia retains control of parts of Ukraine. I think there is some evidence that Ukrainians themselves would settle for that if it really ended the war. And I think that's the key question here. Can we get an agreement that ends the war, not just temporarily, but in the long term? And I think that's very, very unlikely, at least right now. Although I will say, just the fact that the U.S. and Russia are sitting down could possibly create some other opportunities that we haven't yet considered, although I'm very skeptical.
I want to put this question to both Matt Duss and Professor Mearsheimer, because I know that you disagree on this issue, is how did we get to this point? Let's start with you, Matt.
Well, we got to this point because Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine and try to take it over. There's a longer history there, of course. I mean, Professor Mearsheimer has talked a lot about the growth of NATO and how Russia sees that as a threat. I think there is evidence that that is true. I mean, that others have claimed that as well. U.S. officials throughout the 1990s, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, former head of the CIA Bill Burns, have all in their time as diplomats mentioned that this is a real problem for Russia, not just for Putin. However, that does not explain the entire problem. NATO alone was not the cause of this war. Putin himself has made clear various times, most notably in a speech that he gave in June 2021, of his much grander vision of a kind of restored Russian imperium in which Ukraine was a part. So I think the growth of NATO, again, is part of Russia's larger grievance, but I do think Putin has made clear that he has a pretty grandiose historical conception of what he sees as a kind of renewed Russian empire that is simply not consistent, certainly with Ukraine's own sovereignty and independence. And I don't think it's consistent with a kind of a general approach to international affairs that is based in any kind of law or norms.
Professor Mearsheimer.
I think, Amy, before I give you my explanation on what caused the war, it's very important to understand that how you think.
Wasn't it about denazifying Ukraine? No one believed this. I hope. It's just like Israel's goal is not to denazify or de-Hamasify Gaza. Okay? That's not like countries and governments, foreign and domestic, behave in certain ways for their own personal interests, okay, their material interests. But what they say in the process is all marketing. That's it. That's it. It's ridiculous. Do all countries recognize Ukraine as a state? Yes. What? MAGA communists believe it? No, they're just trying to say that to themselves, okay? They're just repeating it to themselves so that they can act like there is a defensible prospect here. And it's really interesting because like so many liberals have gotten mad at me for even bringing up Azov or Ukrainian nationalist movements and their historic allegiance to the Nazi Holocaust and the Nazi initiatives, and also its contemporary versions that are still very much primarily neo-Nazi. And they always get mad when I bring it up to be like, oh, you're giving justifications to Russia. You're actually giving legitimacy to Russia. This is Russian propaganda. It's not. Russia has its own version of neo-Nazis as well. You know, it's not even just the Wagner group either. Like there are a fuck ton of fascists in Russia. Okay. People just make shit up. People say, oh, we're doing this for this reason or that reason. But there's an underlying material reason for all actions that governments engage with. At most, the only argument I will entertain beyond like land grabs, resource extraction, would be security concerns. That's it. And security concerns is also usually a lie, for the record. It's a lie that people tell. But like there's an understandable security concern that like every country has. That's where Mearsheimer's analysis kicks in terms of realpolitik, where he says like there is a reasonable security concern for a foreign power in its own periphery, in its own backyard, to ensure that they don't have further NATO encroachment, especially when this like security cooperation has been designed specifically to undermine Russia and to militarily dominate Russia, starting off with the USSR, but then continuing against Russia as a foreign adversary, even after the dissolution of the USSR.
About the causes of the war has huge implications for how you think about the prospects for actually settling the conflict. Now, Matt basically makes the argument that the principal cause of the war was that Putin had grand ambitions. He wanted to restore the Soviet Union, create a greater Russia or what have you. And he was interested in conquering Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. I don't believe that. I believe there's hardly any evidence to support that line of argument. And I think it's quite clear. In fact, I think there's...
See, this is the part I don't actually agree with him on. Like, I think if Russia had had the power to do so, they absolutely would bring the entirety of the Ukrainian nation state directly back under the banner of Russia. Especially because, like, while it's also marketing to say, oh, Russians and Ukrainians are brothers, and Ukraine means the border, And it's always historically been a part of Russia. Like, all those narratives are still marketing. There is definitely that, I would say, is closer to the reason for why Putin is doing this than denazification. The ties to power situation and wanting to reestablish status as a regional hegemon, but it also seems as though Putin and those around him have an ideology at hand here. Putin has made it very clear that he does not believe in Ukrainian identity. He talks at length about his obsession with imperial Russian history. This is a war for regional hegemony and for Russian identity. It's not either or. Yeah, like the idea that like Russia does not have greater ambition of overtaking Ukraine is I think false. Does it mean that they will fully entertain it? I don't know. He didn't mince words. He said there's no evidence. They have grand ambitions, so should be easily to disprove if there is evidence, right? Yes. The easiest way to disprove it is to listen to fucking Vladimir Putin's own statements when he was talking to Tucker Carlson. What do you mean? If we take at face value the Greater Israel Project coming from Zionists that range all the way from Benjamin Netanyahu to even like the quote-unquote centrist opposition, why wouldn't we take Vladimir Putin's words at face value as well? I'm not saying Mearsheimer is lying. I'm saying that his analysis on this aspect, I think, is incorrect. The evidence is not only trying to, the Russian attempt to overtake much larger parts of Ukraine, including like Western Ukrainian territory, including like literally invading Kyiv, okay? And the other evidence that I have for it is Vladimir Putin's own words. The idea that, Ukraine has always been, Ukraine is not like a sovereign nation state, that Ukraine has always historically been a part of Russia and it should be a part of Russia. That's what he says all the time. I don't think that's like unfair to hear him out on. I think that's a fairly decent amount of evidence. Sounds like you're overly reading between the lines on Mearsheimer here. He might agree with you with what you just said, but his point is they didn't have the power to consequentially freely do this act, and they felt pressure because of NATO expansion. They acted while subject to substantial consequences because of that.
Overwhelming evidence that it was NATO expansion into Ukraine that drove this train. Putin made it clear when NATO first announced in April 2008 that Ukraine would become part of NATO. Putin made it perfectly clear that he viewed this as an existential threat, and this would not be allowed to happen. And the invasion on February 24th, 2022, was driven in large part by fear of NATO expansion. And what that means is that
Mearsheimer's views the same as you and Chapo initially held. No, I remember us rightfully blaming NATO encroachment in 2022. No, what made you get all libbed up all of a sudden? Because Russia invaded. I don't think I'm saying that the only reasonable security concern that I totally agree with Mearsheimer's assessment on is NATO encroachment. But if I knew that that was never going to be a thing, a real thing, and Russia certainly knew that that was never going to be a real thing, then a military invasion of Ukraine was absolutely an insane thing to do, was the wrong thing to do. It was not only immoral and violent, but it was also costly and I think will hurt the Russian country in the long run. And it has already. They have incurred penalties. Yes, of course, NATO encroachment plays a role in this. I literally said that already. I said that just now. That has not changed.
Putin sees NATO expansion. He sees Ukraine and NATO as an existential threat. And because he sees it as an existential threat, he's unwilling to compromise. Many people think that in Alaska, what Trump can do is work out a deal where there's a territorial swap, where there's a ceasefire to start with, and so forth and so on, and the Russians will make this accommodation and that accommodation. That's not true. The Russians have laid out their demands from the very beginning. They have not wavered at all. And the reason they have not wavered is because they view Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat. We, on the other hand, in the West, don't see things that way. We think that that Putin was just aggressive. He didn't get all he wanted, but we can work out a deal with him. I don't think that is an accurate description of reality. I think, again, you want to understand that Ukraine has to be a neutral state. There can be no Ukraine in NATO. There can be no Western security guarantees to Ukraine. But we refuse to accept that. The Ukrainians refuse to accept that. And that's why we're at an impasse today.
Matt Duss, I wanted to ask you, back in the 2013 and 2014 on Democracy Now!, we had the Russia expert Stephen Cohen on many times, and
Your view is valid for the first world, but many third world countries But for many third world countries, Russia is seen as the underdog fighting the hegemon and is supported more than ever today. I have described this as well. I think it's an incorrect assessment, but yes, I have talked about this already. The pro-Palestine, pro-Russia position is very much alive in many, many parts of the world. Parts of the world that we never actually take a look at or care about, but it is definitely a real thing. Russia sells this as a war against Western hegemony. And a lot of people see it like that. And I keep trying to explain this. I keep trying to explain this to people, and they think I'm saying that they think I'm agreeing with that assessment. But yes, this is a very common position outside of the Western world. They clipped me explaining this while simultaneously saying I don't agree with it, and made it seem as though that was my position recently.
He essentially said the same thing. In fact, he insisted that the president who was overthrown, Yanukovych, wanted to maintain the neutrality in the Maidan revolt in 2014, wanted to maintain the neutrality of Ukraine, but it was NATO that was insisting that Ukraine could not be neutral, and that had to take a stand against Russia, and that's part of what then led to his overthrow that the United States clearly backed. Wondering your sense of that, and also, do you think that if Mexico reached a security agreement with China or Russia, stationed troops from those countries in its own country, or missiles from those countries in Mexico, that the United States would sit idly by?
Sure. I mean, all good questions. I mean, first, I want to just respond to something Professor Mearsheimer said. I mean, it's baffling to hear him claim that there's no evidence that Putin wanted to conquer Ukraine and establish a new kind of Russian imperium. Putin has said this explicitly. I would encourage people to look at that June 2021 speech that I mentioned. He also, landed troops outside Kyiv in February 2022 as part of the failed effort to topple Ukraine's government and install his, a friendly Russian government. Those Russian troops were not landed in Kyiv to go camping.
Here we go. Let's make up some bullshit. Yeah, he said it. Sure. Duss information. No, I don't think it's unfair to say. It's not just the 2021 speech, dude. Like, he has literally repeated that over and over again. I think it's interesting how you will contextualize historically pre-October 7th, but not pre-Russian invasion. What about the treatment of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine? Maidan. Russia sits firmly in the anti-imperialist camp, and Ukraine is a running dog of imperialism. This is your lib take. The reason why, first of all, I do factor all of that in. That's number one. Number two, you just don't agree with my analysis after I factor all of that in. So that's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim that you're making. Okay? You want to know why? You want to know why my assessment ultimately is not suited to your, is not aligned with your belief. The reason why it's not is because in order to save the Donbass, you must level the Donbass is a stupid argument. 14,000 people died in the back and forth between the Ukrainian National Guard, the artillery strikes in LPR and DPR, many civilians, right? Airstrikes, artillery strikes. Ukraine is like shelling its own territory because there are Russian speakers and ethnic Russians that live there that want autonomy, let's say, right? That's the argument here. How the f do you justify rolling tanks and mining the entire area as the only acceptable solution here? That's insane. That's insane. Every single world power, both within the periphery and outside of American sphere of influence, makes this exact same argument. Okay? That is the argument that they make. You don't have to believe it. Every single invasion is justifiable with that framework. Putin would like to be dictator of Earth, but that isn't a rational argument for why he would invade any individual country at a specific time. Mearsheimer's position on why the invasion took place when it did is far more coherent, to be honest, even if it requires him being somewhat irrational from your POV on NATO aggression. You believe Russia started this invasion with the idea of occupying Ukraine, a 40 million nation, large country with the backing of Western weapons. Your evidence is speech. Putin can dream of it, but he can't take over the Ukraine, and is not why he did it. Guys, the very fact that he wanted to forcibly overthrow the Ukrainian leadership and implement whatever leadership he thought would be more favorable by literally going into Kyiv is evidence enough that that was a part of his grand design. That was a part of his ambitions. I don't think it's a ridiculous assessment to make. He literally tried it. It failed. Okay? So now he's going through the motions of territorial acquisition that is much more manageable. In the long run, I don't even think that's not going to be manageable anyway. I don't even think that's going to be manageable for the next decade, the next decade plus. Like Russia completely cooked any chances of Georgia entering NATO, any chances of Ukraine entering NATO, which is, I think, a reasonable position to hold regardless, when it took pieces of Ukraine, when it took Crimea and annexed Crimea, when it took pieces of Georgia. Any further incursion beyond that is just is ridiculous. Why are you pretending to be a NATO supporter? I'm not.
So that effort failed, but I think that's clear evidence that Putin's ambitions were much larger.
Why did they let the Baltic countries join NATO then? Because they don't have enough they don't have enough manpower. Russia, for all intents and purposes, will throw manpower in the meat grinder to win a war of attrition. But they also understand their limitations, especially because they don't have America backing them like Israel. So Israel can do a 7-front war because they're psycho, especially because all of the countries that that Israel is dominating have already been dominated by America before Israel gets to blow them up because they have no anti-air defense systems, for example. But the reason why Finland and Sweden, which previously had a dual neutrality agreement with Russia and didn't join NATO, was partially because Russia's invasion of Ukraine gave them, one, made them fearful. Two, if you want to look at it cynically, gave them the reason for why they could advocate to join NATO. And also, Russia's failure to overtake Ukraine in a short period of time, like they said he was going to be able to, made it so that Finland could join without fear of Russian invasion. That's it.
Then the professor seems to claim.
Like the point is, I guess it's like almost the way I look at the situation is almost like, if you can understand why the global South would see Russia as like the militant vengeance against the hegemonic superpower that's dominated them, you should also be able to understand why countries that are in the immediate vicinity of Russia would be fearful of Russian incursion, especially after Russia literally did invade Ukraine. And not only did it invade Ukraine, they didn't just like roll the tanks and just take over Ukraine with ease, but instead Ukraine was able to, with the entire backing of the West, capable of pushing back Russia. This showed all of the neighboring countries that, one, there was good reason for them to join this American security cooperation, and two, they would most likely not be able to, they would most likely not have to withstand any sort of like Russian military conquest because Russia had its hands full with Ukraine.
Now, with regard to the Maidan and Yanukovych, I don't think I would put this on NATO. Clearly, as I said, Russia and Putin have seen the growth of NATO as a threat. I think we should take that seriously. That's something we need to discuss. I would also note that countries are not absorbed into NATO. Countries...
entire backing of the West, seriously? Yes. Are we going to act like the Western nations were not on board with allowing, with giving Ukraine the capabilities to defend itself? What are you talking about? Okay, that I disagree with. What the are you? Is this like a weird semantics argument that factors Hungary as like the lion of the West or something? Is that your argument? Hungary, the real lion of the West, was actually not a part of this coalition, and therefore it wasn't the entirety of Western nations. This is one of those shadows of the POV of like anything less than nukes or foreign boots on the ground armies isn't actually support as wild. Yeah, I just nobody said they emptied every armory, chatter. Yeah.
In Europe have sought to join NATO. This is not something that is being imposed on them. They see joining NATO as part of their security. Again, that's not to diminish, I think, the kind of the way that Russia sees this as provocative. I do think we need to take that seriously. But the Maidan Revolution was not about NATO. The Maidan Revolution was about the people of Ukraine seeking closer relationships with Europe rather than closer relationships with Russia. And I think it's important to note
converging interests, classic tool of American State Department. You got people who have anger and resentment towards their administration. America comes in. It's already established civil society organizations and numerous other means of pushing buttons. They take advantage of one of the poorest countries in Eastern Europe at the time. Okay, they take advantage of the volatility and move the organic protests that develop in a direction that suits their interests.
That this is not something that was driven by NATO. This was something that was driven by the Ukrainian people. And I think this constant obsession with NATO really denies Ukrainians their own agency. And I think we need to put that really at the center of this conversation. Now, your question about Mexico.
Like the example of America's success, if you look at color revolutions, or if you look at the Arab Spring, right? Those are examples of American success. A genuine instability creates resentment. People rise up, and then America takes advantage of that destabilization to either further destabilize the country or to literally push their own to push their own people into gaining more power and influence. But a failed version of that was with Hong Kong. Understandable desire for people living in Hong Kong not to be under the influence of China, even though it was obviously on a lease, basically like a loaner agreement to England, to the UK, and it was slated to end regardless, and they just like accelerated that process. But it was ultimately a failure. Now China completely controls Hong Kong. I'm saying it was a failure from the West's position, or maybe the U.S. is behind the uprisings. No, this is also silly. Okay, that's a silly, like, the CIA does not have a hypnosis tool. Okay, no, they can only take advantage of the actual fears that people have, the actual anger and resentment that people have. They can't just like whip up a protest out of nowhere. Okay. This is something that a lot of people fail to contend with. Like, a lot of leftists look at this. This is not a centrist position. This is just a correct position. Okay. They can't just like radio free Europe or radio free China their way into mass instability. Look at Iran. Look at the decades of American propaganda. They can fund certain initiatives and take advantage of them. There's a great book by Vincent Bevins about all the 2010s protests called If We Burn. Yes, it highlights the failures of horizontalism in these movements. Like, think about it this way. If the CIA had that much motion, there wouldn't be this much anti-Israel sentiment right now in American society, in the Western world. Come on. If the CIA had the capability of just like kickstarting protests out of nowhere it was just not even like, they weren't even like using the genuine instability and anger that the people had to their benefit, to suit their purpose, to overtake movements, okay, then they would be able to just use that hypnosis beam on American society broadly and make them all pro-Israel. A lot of people treat these type of color revolutions as identical to things like U.S.-backed military coups, but it's totally different. Usually, it's an organic protest movement that Western interests invest themselves in to make sure that the end result is on their side, but the grievances are real, and the protest would have happened anyway. Exactly. So you're legitimizing the protest, even if the CIA is involved. Is that your take? No, I'm an adult that's telling you how these things work. The idea that like you're just denying reality if you think that there aren't people who are angry and resentful in these areas, in these countries, and aren't like going to have a protest regardless. And if you think that like the United States of America is able to single-handedly make protests happen, it's crazy.
Clearly, if Mexico was to sign a security agreement with Russia or China or any other power, the United States would probably have something to say about it. I think that's something we should work through diplomatically. That would not, in my view, justify the United States invading and occupying parts of Mexico in response.
I want to talk about what Ukrainians want. First, going to Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, speaking to reporters during a joint briefing in Berlin with the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz.
They did it in Chile? No. The end result of Chile was a military dictatorship that was backed by the United States of America. Is a coup. You're describing a coup, an American-backed coup. You can't compare an American-backed coup to America taking advantage of like existing instability to suit their purposes of encroaching on different forms of governance that is like more servile to Western interests, to prop up and make people believe that like this method is going to be more successful for them, to give them true sovereignty.
We must prepare a trilateral format for the conversation. There must be a ceasefire, number one. There must be really reliable security guarantees. Today, by the way, President Trump spoke about supporting this and about America's readiness to participate. Also, among the agreed principles, Russia cannot have a veto right over Ukraine's European and NATO prospects. And peace talks should be combined with appropriate pressure on Russia. Sanctions must be in place, and they must be strengthened if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire in Alaska.
Let me go to Professor Mearsheimer first and point out that there was just this Gallup poll. More than 3 years into the war, Ukrainian support for continuing to fight until victory has hit a new low. In Gallup's most recent poll of Ukraine, conducted...
Can you explain why the Azov Battalion visited Hong Kong during the protest? Can you explain why all the student leaders of the protest met with U.S. officials, including Nancy Pelosi and Marco Rubio? Yeah, exactly what I'm stating. Do you think that there wasn't fears from young people living in Hong Kong and just like people broadly that whether warranted or unwarranted, that like the Chinese control over Hong Kong, which was obviously an inevitability, would eventually lead to people existing under a more repressive state? Whether warranted or unwarranted, don't you think that that was like a real fear that people had? Come on now. Like, you think student leaders in Hong Kong that met with fucking Marco Rubio have the capacity to bring thousands of people to the streets? No. And it ultimately failed regardless, because China is a more powerful country that you cannot meddle in the affairs of, as opposed to engaging in some kind of proxy war with Russia by using Ukraine. That's why I'm saying it was a failure at the end of the day. And the more Donald Trump does shit like this and causes broad instability around the globe, and the more America's hegemonic status and its influence wanes in the international stage, the less soft power initiatives and the less like destabilizing initiatives they can engage with. That much is clear. So the delusions of petty bourgeois and the interests that benefit from independence are having to compete with Chinese capital means the U.S. should destabilize China. Got it? Did I say any of those things? Did any of those words come out of my mouth? Did I say anything like that? Why are you saying this?
in early July, 69% say they favor a negotiated end to the war as soon as possible, compared with 24% who support continuing to fight until victory. Let's go back to 2022. Three-quarters, 73% in Ukraine, favored Ukraine fighting until victory. Let's get your response, Professor, and then Matt Duss.
Well, I think it's not surprising that enthusiasm for the war in the Ukrainian body politic has diminished. They've suffered enormous casualties. The Russians have been winning on the battlefield.
Fanboy Mao.
And it doesn't look like Ukraine can rescue the situation.
Hype train level 2 has been achieved. The Piker Broadcasting Service is funded by you, the viewers, for you, the viewers. No ads. Just pure content, baby.
Or that the West can help Ukraine rescue the situation. So obviously down below in Ukrainian society, support for the war is beginning to melt away. The problem is that at the elite level, there's no evidence that anyone is willing to cut a deal with the Russians. And again, you want to understand that the Russians are driving a hard bargain here. They're driving a really hard bargain. It will be extremely difficult, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, for any Ukrainian leader to accept the terms that the Russians have on the table and don't show any flexibility with regard to. Now, what the Ukrainian elites are hoping they can do is they're hoping that they can drag the Americans and they can drag the Europeans into giving meaningful security guarantees to Ukraine for the future, and that they will continue, the West will continue to support Ukraine, and that at some point in the future, Russia will weaken and Ukraine will be in a position, with help from the West, to get territory that it's now lost back from Russia. That's their great hope. So the elites are willing to hang in there, and this is what you see reflected in Zelensky's comments. But the question you have to ask yourself, Amy, is what is going to happen to Ukraine in this war as it continues to lose on the battlefield and support at home melts away? One would think at some point Ukraine will collapse. Given historical evidence, that is the likely outcome.
Matt Duss, do you agree?
Yeah, I do pretty much agree, except I would not put so much on Ukraine's elites. Clearly, there are some in the Ukrainian government, who fit the characterization that the professor just made. But I think what's important here to note is that there is growing support among Ukrainians, as you noted, to end this war. If you could have a durable and real end to the war. I don't think we should, with regard to President Zelensky's comments, I don't think anyone should be surprised. I don't think anyone
I think a lot of people misunderstand when I say that, like, Putin had an ambition for taking over and seizing a larger part of Ukrainian territory, as like he will never actually concede to any sort of ceasefire, no matter how much he gets out of it, because he will then turn around and eventually invade the rest of Ukraine. So that's why I think a lot of people push back when I disagree with Mearsheimer on that aspect. That's not what I'm saying. I think it's on the conditions of this ceasefire. It's up to America as the major power player on the Ukrainian side to set the stage that makes it more costly for Russia to try and do this again in the future, and makes it so that Russia is comfortable with whatever territory that they've taken so far, and doesn't think to continue waging this kind of battle and militarily take over larger swaths of Ukrainian land.
Should expect the president of Ukraine to kind of preemptively concede territory. I do think that if there was an offer or an agreement in the works that really ended the war, the government of Ukraine could probably be, pressured into agreeing to it. They understand there is political support in the country, even though it will be a very, very tough decision.
If not militarily, how else is someone supposed to defend themselves against NATO imperialist expansion? Diplomacy clearly didn't work. They rejected Russian membership before any of the other invasions. It seems you're trying to come up with talking points in fear of being labeled a NATO asset. Yeah, I'm so scared of being fucking labeled a NATO asset to the 11 leftists, myself included, that's anti-NATO openly. Are you stupid? Being pro-NATO and claiming you're a leftist is the normal position in America, dumbass. It's like people complaining that I'm actually trying to hide my transphobia or some shit. It's like being transphobic is the popular position in America. Okay? There's no reason for me to try to withstand this kind of propaganda. It's just what I believe. I'm anti-NATO, and it's not something that I hide. And it's unironically an incredibly unpopular position. And it's half the reason why people yell at me all the goddamn time, because Western chauvinists can't contend with the reality that NATO is the most significant protection racket that America has in order to continue its imperial domination around the globe.
To accept a large part of their country is now under the control of Russia. But again, the key question here is his ultimate goal. And there is no evidence that Putin is willing to...
That's a gross oversimplification of NATO? No, that's not a gross oversimplification of NATO. It's just the most accurate assessment of NATO.
Enter such an agreement that really ends the war. That is the key problem here.
People once again think that, like, Baltic states that wanted to join NATO personally are the reason why NATO must exist or something. Ultimately, it comes down to whether or not you think America is a force for good around the globe. And I think Americans at the end of the day believe that. No matter how hard I try to explain to them the history of American domination post-World War II, people just can't let that go. It's understandable. You live here, okay? This is the environment you were born into. You're just never going to let that go. Personally, you think it's best that America remain the world police, and you are fearful that if America tried to maintain diplomacy and try to deal with other countries, not as like adversaries, but instead just simply other nation states, and there were numerous cooperative agreements with even like the countries that were historically considered foreign adversaries, that would give grounds to, I don't know, the foreign adversaries to do really scary stuff, to do America shit back to America and America's allies. That's the underlying fear for many Americans, and that's the reason why when push comes to shove, most people side with America maintaining its hegemonic superpower status. That's why there's so much animosity on this issue whenever I talk about it.
Mearsheimer, I wanted to ask you a couple of facts that are startling to me. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s and Ukraine became independent, Ukraine had a population of 52 million people. By the time the war started with Russia, the population was already down to 40 million. And today the estimates are, given the outmigration, the refugees that have left, the continuing high death rate and low birth rate, that there's only about 28 million people in the current Ukraine. This is an astonishing decline of population for a country. Has Ukraine essentially been a country that's been disintegrating ever since the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, let me make 2 points on this. First of all, the phrase is sometimes used to describe the situation in Ukraine that it is in a demographic death spiral. Just think about those words. It's in a demographic death spiral. And what this war has done is ended up killing huge numbers of Ukrainians. And furthermore, huge numbers of Ukrainians have left the country. And I would surmise that many of them will not return. So this is a disaster from a demographic point of view.
We just have 30 seconds, Professor.
Is if you look, Ukraine is going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state as well. And this is a disaster of great proportions.
He's right about this. Ukraine already was like unstable to begin with, even before the Russian invasion. And it is going to be, I mean, it is already in an infinitely worse state now, stuck between two superpowers, one regional power and one global power. and they're cooked, and now they have a fuck ton of weapons. And also on top of that, the most nationalist forces are now seen as the great emancipatory force that was necessary to push back, and they're national heroes. The very same people that would duke it out in the streets when these guys were like football hooligans, okay? Like the Azov Battalion and all the fucking Nazis and shit that initially were causing rampage on Ukrainian streets, and all the anarchists and all the fucking anti-fascists in Ukraine that were fighting them ended up fighting alongside them against a much larger force that was killing their family members. That much larger force is Russia, is cooked, is entirely cooked. I don't see any way out of this. And I think it's going to lead to even more chaos. Can you explain your position on NATO to help me understand if it's the only position, as it is the only position I disagree with you on? It's too long to get into right now, but I have talked about it extensively. I'm going to go and look for, I don't know, any number of different videos that I've done on the matter.
You think, in 15 seconds, how do you think this should end?
I think it should end with the Ukrainians doing everything they can to concede to the Russians and put an end to the war. I don't think they're going to get a better deal if they fight on.
10 seconds.
I think the best thing to do is cut it now.
I would agree. I wrote a piece with my colleague Rob Farley back in November for Foreign Policy magazine saying this was the time for the Ukrainians to make the best peace they can. Basically saying that if they can concede part of Ukraine that Russia now controls, they should do it. But the question is, will that really end the war? And the problem is we see no evidence that Putin is interested.
We have to leave it there. Matt Duss and Professor John Mearsheimer.